In the autumn of 732, two battles were fought at opposite ends of the Christian world. One of them you know, the other almost nobody knows. The Battle of Tours, October 732. Charles Martel, the Frankish warlord they called the Hammer, meets an Umayyad army somewhere between Tours and Poitiers in central France. The Muslim forces have pushed north from Spain across the Pyrenees, through Aquitaine, deep into Frankish territory. For days, the two armies face each other, then the Franks hold. The Umayyad commander, Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, is killed. His army retreats south, never to penetrate that far into Europe again. Tours enters the Western imagination as the moment Islam was stopped. The hinge, the barrier. Medieval chroniclers call it a divine judgment. 18th century historians frame it as the salvation of Christian Europe. Even today, Charles Martel's name is taught in schools across the Western world as the man who saved the continent from the caliphate. Here is what those schools do not teach. At the same moment that Charles Martel's infantry stood firm in the fields of Francia, a different army was fighting the same enemy, the same Umayyad Caliphate, 2,000 miles to the east. This army did not fight on foot with shields locked. It fought on horseback, in the mountains, against a general who would later become the last Umayyad Caliph, and it won, more decisively than Tours, more completely, and the people who won that battle were not Christians at all. They were the Khazars. The Caucasus Mountains run between the Black Sea and the Caspian, a jagged wall of rock and ice that separates the steppe of what is now southern Russia from the plains of the Middle East. In the 8th century, those mountain passes were the only viable overland route for an army moving from the Islam heartlands into Eastern Europe. There is no other way. The Black Sea blocks the west, the Caspian blocks the east. If you want to march a large army north out of the Caliphate and into the open grass lands that lead to the Volga, the Don, the Dnieper, the rivers that feed into the Slavic heartland, the Baltic trade routes, the undefended forests of what will become Russia and Ukraine and Poland, you have to go through the Caucasus. And to go through the Caucasus, you have to go through the Khazars. The Umayyad Caliphate in the early 8th century was the largest empire the world had ever seen. It stretched from the Indus River in the east to the Atlantic coast of Portugal in the west. Its armies had toppled the Persian Empire entirely. They had taken half the territory of the Byzantine Empire, including Syria, Egypt, North Africa, and most of Anatolia. They had crossed into Spain. They were pushing into France. And in the Caucasus, they had been trying for decades to break through the Khazar defences and flood north onto the steppe. If they succeeded, there was nothing between them and the Volga River except scattered tribes. No organised state, no standing army, no fortifications, just open ground all the way to the forests of the north. The Khazar state, by contrast, was young. It had emerged in the mid-7th century from the collapse of the Göktürk Confederation, a Turkic people who had established themselves between the Caspian and Black Seas. But by 732, the Khazars were not a loose collection of steppe riders. They had a capital city on the Volga Delta, they had a functioning tax system, they had diplomatic relations with Byzantium, and they had a military machine that combined the mobility of steppe cavalry with the logistics of an organised sedentary state. The Arab sources describe Khazar heavy cavalry wearing armour that covered both rider and horse. They fought with composite bows, lances, and curved swords. They could move faster than any infantry army and strike harder than any lightly armoured raiding party. And in the mountain passes of the Caucasus, where manoeuvre mattered more than numbers, they were devastating. In 732, the Umayyad general Marwan ibn Muhammad, a veteran commander, a member of the ruling family, a man who would in 12 years seize the caliphate itself, led a major expedition north through the Caucasus. The goal was to break the Khazar hold on the passes permanently. What happened instead was a catastrophe for the caliphate. The details of the battle itself are frustratingly sparse. Arab chronicles, which documented victories in lavish detail, tend to be brief about defeats. What we know is that the Khazar army, commanded by a general referred to in the sources only as the Khagan's deputy, met Marwan's forces somewhere in the mountain approaches. The Khazars used the terrain, they used their mobility, and they routed the Umayyad army so thoroughly that Marwan was forced to retreat south with enormous losses, a defeat so severe that, according to one chronicler, Marwan's surviving troops had to burn their own baggage to move fast enough to escape, a defeat so complete that the Umayyad Caliphate never again mounted a serious attempt to push through the Caucasus and into the European steppe. The northern gate held. For the next 3 centuries, it would stay held. That is the military reality. Now here is the judgment that hangs over it. Edward Gibbon, the 18th century English historian, not given to hyperbole, careful with his superlatives, wrote of this battle that it was one of the events that determined whether Europe would become Islamic. He did not say that about Tours. He said it about the Khazar victory in the Caucasus. Gibbon understood something that later historians forgot. The threat to Europe from the south, through Spain, across the Pyrenees, was real, but it was a secondary front. The Caliphate in Spain was operating at the extreme end of a supply line that stretched thousands of miles back to Damascus. Frankish resistance was organised. The terrain favoured defence. The Umayyad force at Tours was a raiding army, not an invasion force designed to conquer and hold territory permanently. Even if Tours had been lost, the Islamic presence in Western Europe would have faced the same logistical problems that eventually contained it anyway. The Caucasus was different. A breakthrough there would have opened the entire Eastern European plain. No Alps, no Pyrenees, no organised Frankish kingdom with a standing army waiting on the other side. Just grassland and river valleys, the same corridors that steppe peoples had used for centuries to move west, now open to an army backed by one of the richest and most administratively sophisticated empires in the world. If the Khazars had broken, the map of Eastern Europe, its languages, its religions, its entire cultural trajectory would probably be unrecognisable today. The Khazars did not break, they held. And then, within a few decades of this victory, their ruling elite made a decision that makes the whole story stranger still. They converted to Judaism. Think about what that means. In the 8th century, a Turkic steppe empire controlling the most critical military choke point in Eastern Europe chose to become Jewish. Not Christian, not Muslim, Jewish. At a time when the Byzantine Empire was pressing them to accept Orthodox Christianity, and the Caliphate was pressing them to accept Islam, they chose neither. They chose a third path, a faith with no empire behind it, no army to call on, no powerful earthly patron, and they did it from a position of strength. After they had already proven they could defeat the Caliphate in open battle. But that part of the story comes later. The point right now is simpler. In 732, the Umayyad Caliphate was at the peak of its power, expanding in every direction, and a Jewish army stopped it cold in the mountains. The battle is almost entirely unknown in the Western world. The empire that won it has been erased so thoroughly from memory that most people hearing this have never encountered the name Khazar before. You might be one of them. And if you are, that is not your fault. It is a hole in the way we tell history. Before we go further into who the Khazars were and how they built what they built, let me pause for just a moment. This is the kind of story that people discover at strange hours. Maybe you are watching this properly, following every detail. Maybe you are drifting off to sleep and the names are washing over you like a tide. Either way, drop a comment. Tell us where in the world you are from and what time it is there. And if there is an empire or a people you have always wondered about, something that feels like a gap in your own education, tell us that too. We read those comments. They genuinely shape what we make next. And if you want to be part of that, the finding of forgotten things, hit subscribe. Now, back to the steppe, back to the grass, back to a people who are about to build something that the world has never quite known how to remember. The Eurasian steppe is not empty. It looks empty in satellite photographs. A green-brown band stretching from Manchuria to Hungary, 5,000 miles of grassland with almost no vertical interruption. But at ground level, it teems. The grass grows taller than a man in some places, chest-high in others, and when the wind moves through it, the whole world seems to breathe. In spring, the steppe explodes with wildflowers. Purple iris, red tulips, yellow fritillaria, blooms that appear for a few weeks and then vanish, leaving only the grass and the sky. The sky is the thing you would notice first. There is so much of it. On the open steppe, the horizon feels farther away than it should be, the dome of the heavens pressing down on all sides, and at night the stars are so dense they look like spilled salt. This is not a landscape that invites small thinking. It is a landscape that produces empires. The Khazars came out of this grassland in the middle of the 6th century. They were a Turkic people, part of a much larger confederation called the Gökturks, the Blue Turks, who had built the first great empire a generation earlier. The Gökturk Khaganate, at its height, stretched from the borders of China to the Black Sea, controlling the entire central corridor of Eurasia. It was the kind of power that made sedentary civilizations nervous. Byzantine diplomats sent embassies to the Gökturk court. Chinese emperors paid tribute to keep the frontier quiet. For a few decades in the late 6th century, the Gökturks were simply the dominant force in the known world east of Persia. But steppe empires are fragile things. They depend on a single ruling clan, holding the loyalty of dozens of subordinate tribes spread across enormous distances. And when the succession fails, the whole structure comes apart. In the early 7th century, the Göktürk Khaganate fractured. Civil war, external pressure from the Tang dynasty in China, and the sheer difficulty of governing half a continent from horseback caused it to split into eastern and western halves. The western half, which controlled the territory between the Caspian and Black Seas, collapsed further. Tribes that had been part of the Confederation began to assert their independence. One of those tribes was the Khazars. Where exactly they came from before the Confederation broke apart, the sources do not tell us clearly. Turkic oral tradition preserved genealogies, not maps. What we know is that by the 630s, the Khazars were an identifiable political entity controlling the northwestern corner of the former Göktürk domain, the grasslands between the northern Caspian shore, the lower Volga, and the foothills of the Caucasus. It was not the richest part of the steppe, it was not the most prestigious, but it was, in one crucial respect, the most strategically located territory in the entire Western Eurasian world. Look at a map. The Caspian Sea is not really a sea at all. It is the largest lake on Earth, a saltwater body the size of Germany, and it forms a natural barrier between the steppe and the Iranian plateau. North of the Caspian, the land narrows between the sea and the Ural Mountains, creating one of the great choke points of world geography. Everything moving east-west across the northern steppe has to pass through that corridor. Everything moving north-south between the Middle East and the Volga Basin has to pass through the Caucasus, which the Khazars also controlled. Put those two facts together, and you understand the entire economic and military logic of the Khazar Empire before it even existed. The Khazars sat on the intersection, silks from China moving west, silver from the Islamic world moving north, furs, amber, wax, honey, and slaves from the northern forests moving south. Every merchant, every caravan, every shipment of precious metal that wanted to cross between the great civilizational spheres had to cross Khazar territory and pay Khazar tolls. This is not conquest wealth, looting cities and carrying off treasure. This is something more durable. This is positional wealth, the kind that accumulates year after year, century after century, as long as you can hold the ground. And the Khazars held it. By the middle of the 7th century, around 650 AD, give or take a decade, the Khazars had done something that steppe peoples almost never did. They had stopped moving. The traditional life of a Turkic steppe people was pastoral nomadism, moving with the herds between summer and winter pastures, living in felt tents, following the grass. It was a life of extraordinary freedom and extraordinary fragility. Your wealth walked on four legs: a bad winter, a drought, a cattle raid by a rival tribe, and a chieftain could lose everything. States built on nomadism tend to be temporary. They flare up around a charismatic leader and then dissolve when he dies. The Khazars chose a different path. They built a capital. Itil, the name probably means river in the old Turkic tongue, was founded on the Volga Delta, where the great river splits into dozens of channels and empties into the Caspian Sea. The delta is a strange landscape, half water and half land, a maze of reed beds and islands and shifting sandbars. It is not obviously a place where you would build a permanent city, but it offered something the open steppe did not: defensibility, fresh water, access to the sea, and absolute control over the river traffic moving between the northern forests and the Caspian Basin. The Volga is not just a river, it is the aorta of Western Eurasia. It rises in the forest northwest of Moscow and flows over 2,000 miles south to the Caspian, draining a basin the size of France and Germany combined. In the medieval period, it was the main artery connecting the Baltic trade networks to the Islamic world. Viking merchants, the Rus, the Varangians, came down the Volga in their long ships, carrying furs and swords and slaves. They met Arab and Persian merchants at Itil, who paid in silver dirhams minted in Baghdad and Samarkand. The Khazars took a tithe, 1/10 of everything, and grew rich. This is the moment when the Khazar story stops being about a tribe and starts being about a state, a permanent capital, a tax system, a standing military that was not just the armed male population mobilized for a raid, but a professional force that could campaign hundreds of miles from its supply base and sustain operations for months. The Arab sources describe Khazar armies numbering in the thousands, with heavy cavalry equipped in a way that shocked their enemies, armoured horses, disciplined formations, the ability to fight set-piece battles rather than just hit and run. The transition happened fast. Within a single lifetime, roughly between 630 and 670 AD, the Khazars went from being one fragment of a collapsed steppe confederation to being the dominant power north of the Caucasus. with diplomatic relations stretching to Constantinople, a capital city that would eventually grow to dwarf anything in Western Europe, and a treasury fed by the richer fish roots of the medieval world. How did they do it so quickly? Part of the answer is the vacuum. When the Göktürk Khaganate collapsed, it left a power void across the entire western steppe. The Khazars were not the only tribe competing to fill it, but they were the most disciplined, the most strategically positioned, and, this matters, the most administratively imaginative. They did not simply replicate the old Göktürk model of a tribal confederation held together by a sacred ruling clan. They built institutions, tax collectors, judges, a permanent bureaucracy that could function whether the Khagan was on campaign or not. Part of the answer is the trade routes. The 7th century was a period of explosive commercial integration across Eurasia. The Tanga dynasty had stabilized China. The Islamic conquests had unified the Middle East into a single economic zone stretching from Spain to the Indus. The Byzantine Empire, though shrinking, was still the richest state in Christendom. All of these civilizations wanted to trade with each other, and the overland route that connected them ran straight through Khazar territory. The Khazars did not create this trade. They simply controlled the choke points and extracted the wealth, and then used that wealth to build a state that could control the choke points permanently. This is not the story of barbarians who got lucky. It is the story of a people who understood exactly where they were and exactly what that position was worth. By the time the Umayyad Caliphate began pushing north through the Caucasus in the late 7th century, the Khazars were ready. They had a capital, they had a treasury, they had a professional army, they had diplomatic channels with Constantinople that would eventually produce a marriage alliance between a Khazar princess and a Byzantine emperor. They were, in every meaningful sense, a fully formed state, and the only thing standing between the largest empire on earth and the undefended plains of Eastern Europe. The Battle of 732 did not come out of nowhere. It was the collision of two systems that had been building toward each other for decades. The Caliphate, expanding north, the Khazars, settling down, the mountains in between. Smell it first. Before you see the city, you smell it. Wood smoke from 10,000 cooking fires, fish drying on racks along the riverbank, spices moving through the market, cinnamon that travelled from Ceylon, pepper from the Malabar coast, frankincense that crossed the Arabian desert. The air over the Volga Delta is thick and alive, and it tells you something before your eyes confirm it. This is not a frontier outpost. This is a metropolis. Itil rises from the delta in the middle of the 8th century, like a city that refuses to make sense. The Volga splits into dozens of channels here, a maze of water and reed beds and low islands, and the Khazars have built their capital directly into the marsh. Wooden causeways connect the islands. Boats are as common as horses. The buildings are timber and mud brick, built on raised platforms to keep them above the spring floods, and from the water, the city looks like a forest of roofs stretching to the horizon. How many people lived here? The Arab geographers give numbers that sound like exaggerations until you check them against European cities of the same period. 50,000 at the low end, several 100,000 at the high end. Even the conservative estimate makes Itil larger than Paris, larger than London, larger than any city west of Constantinople or east of Baghdad. At a time when Aachen, Charlemagne's capital, had perhaps 10,000 residents, Itil's markets alone employed more people than most European towns. The harbour is the heart of the city. The Volga here is wide and slow, a brown current moving south toward the Caspian, and the docks stretch for more than a mile along both banks. You can stand on the wharf at midday and count ships from half a dozen civilizations. The long, narrow boats of the Rus, built to navigate both rivers and open sea, their hulls loaded with bundles of sable and ermine pelts. The round-bottomed merchant vessels of the Abbasids, their decks stacked with amphorae of olive oil and bales of Egyptian linen. Flat barges from the upper Volga carrying honey in clay jars, beeswax in blocks the size of a man's chest, and amber from the Baltic coast. That strange golden stone that medieval people believed trapped the light of the sun, and everywhere, the silver. The dirham is the currency of this world. Minted in Baghdad, Damascus, Samarkand, the Abbasid Caliphate produced silver coins by the millions, and a staggering percentage of them ended up here. Hoards of Islamic silver have been found buried across Scandinavia and the Baltic, tens of thousands of coins, and almost all of them passed through Khazar hands first. The Khazars did not mint their own currency. They did not need to. They took a tithe, 1/10 of every shipment that moved through their territory, and the silver accumulated in their treasury like water behind a dam. Ibn Rusta saw it. He was an Arab geographer writing in the early 10th century, and his description of Itil is the most detailed eyewitness account that survives. He walked through the markets, he spoke to the merchants, and he recorded something that tells you more about the Khazar state than any battle narrative could. The Khazar king has 7 judges, Ibn Rusta wrote, 2 for the Jews, 2 for the Muslims, 2 for the Christians, and 1 for the pagans, so that each law is judged by its own. Pause on that sentence. A steppe empire in the 9th century, a people the outside world dismissed as horse nomads, built a legal system that recognized 4 distinct religious communities, each governing itself under its own traditions, all of them answerable to a single Khagan who sat in a palace above the river. This is not tolerance in the modern sense. It is not a philosophical commitment to pluralism. It is something colder and more interesting, a commercial strategy. Trade requires predictability. Merchants will not bring their goods to a city where they cannot enforce contracts, resolve disputes, or trust that their property rights will be respected. The Khazars understood this perfectly. If a dispute arose between 2 Muslim merchants, it went to the Muslim judges, who ruled according to Islamic law. If a Christian and a Jew had a disagreement, the case went to a mixed panel, and the Khagan's officials enforced the ruling. Every merchant who arrived in Itil knew that the law he would face was, in large part, his own law. That certainty was worth more than any single shipment of silver. Whether you are watching this properly or letting it play in the background while you drift towards sleep, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are right now. We get viewers from places that would genuinely surprise you. People listening in Reykjavik, in Singapore, in a dorm room in Buenos Aires at 3 in the morning. It is a strange and lovely thing to think about. All of us connected across time zones by a story about a city that most of the world has forgotten. Anyway, back to Itil. The city was physically divided into quarters, and the divisions were real. The Jewish quarter sat on one island, the Muslim quarter on another, the Christian and pagan quarters on their own rises of dry land above the marsh. Each had its own markets, its own bathhouses, its own places of worship. The mosque in the Muslim quarter had a minaret that rose above the rooftops, a needle of baked brick visible from the river. The synagogues in the Jewish quarter used Hebrew script in their records, the same alphabet the Khagan scribes employed for state correspondence. The Christian quarter had churches serving both Byzantine and Armenian rites. The pagan quarter maintained shrines to the old Turkic sky god Tengri, where worshippers still made offerings of fermented mare's milk and hung strips of coloured cloth from wooden poles. 4 faiths, 4 legal systems, 1 city. What held it together was not ideology but revenue. The Khazars did not tax the Muslims among them, Ibn Rusta noted, a policy that encouraged Muslim merchants, who might otherwise have been reluctant to enrich a non-Islamic state, to settle permanently in Itil and conduct their business there. The Rus, by contrast, were not residents but visitors, and the Khazars took their 10% from every Rus ship without exception. The system was calibrated precisely to extract maximum wealth while provoking minimum resistance. Walk through the market in your mind. There is a furrier's stall where sable pelts, the most valuable fur in the medieval world, darker and softer than anything produced in Europe, hang in bundles of 40, the standard trading unit. Next to it, a slave market. The slave trade was one of the primary engines of the Khazar economy, and we should not soften this. Men and women captured in raids on the northern forests, Slavs and Finns and Balts, sold south to the Islamic world through Itil's markets. The Arab sources describe the fair-skinned slaves of the north as highly prized in Baghdad and Cairo. This is not a pleasant fact. It is a true one. Across the aisle, a Persian merchant unrolls a bolt of silk brocade, the pattern woven with gold thread, a textile that cost more than most people in the city would earn in a lifetime. A Khazar official in a felt coat, the traditional dress of the steppe, practical and warm, counts out silver dirhams to pay the customs duty. The merchant records the transaction in Arabic script on a scrap of papyrus. The official marks it in Hebrew characters on a wax tablet. This was the Khazar achievement, and it lasted for nearly 300 years. A Turkic people from the grasslands, the same grasslands that had produced Attila and would later produce Genghis Khan, chose not to sack the cities at the edge of their world, but to build one of their own. They created a place where the trade routes of half the planet intersected, where 4 religions operated their own courts under a single sovereign, and where a merchant could arrive with a cargo of furs from the Arctic and leave with a shipment of silk from China. All of it taxed, regulated, and legally protected by a state that the outside world barely understood and quickly forgot. From the water, as darkness fell, Itil would have glowed. Cooking fires and oil lamps reflected in the channels of the delta, thousands of points of light scattered across the islands like the stars above the steppe had fallen into the river. A traveller approaching by boat in the 9th century, coming south from the cold forests of the north, where settlements of more than a few hundred people were almost unknown, would have seen something that looked less like a city than like a vision. The Caucasus Mountains are not a range you can simply walk around. They run from the Black Sea to the Caspian, a wall of rock and ice nearly 700 miles long, with peaks that rise above 18,000 feet. Glaciers cling to the high passes. Avalanches thunder down even in summer. For an army, there are exactly 2 routes through: the Darial Pass in the centre, a narrow gorge where the Terek River cuts through the mountains, and the Derbent corridor along the Caspian coast, where a slim strip of land runs between the sea and the peaks. That coastal corridor at Derbent is barely 3 kilometres wide. On one side, the easternmost spurs of the Caucasus drop almost vertically to the plain. On the other, the Caspian surf beats against a shoreline that has barely shifted in 2,000 years. Anyone who wanted to move an army from the Islamic south into the steppe north had come through this bottleneck. The Persians knew it. They built a fortress there in the 6th century. Massive stone walls that ran from the mountain slope straight into the sea, a barrier designed to keep northern nomads out. By the 7th century, the Khazars controlled the northern side of that wall, and what they were holding back was no longer Persian. The Umayyad Caliphate by the year 640 was the most explosive military force the world had seen since Rome. In less than 2 decades after the Prophet Muhammad's death, Arab armies had shattered the Sassanid Persian Empire entirely and stripped the Byzantine Empire of Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. Their advance seemed inexhaustible. Along the southern shore of the Mediterranean, they pushed west until they reached the Atlantic. In 711, just 19 years before our battle, they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and began the conquest of Visigothic Spain. In the east, they moved through Persia and into Central Asia, reaching the borders of Tang China. And in the north, they turned toward the Caucasus passes. The Arab-Khazar wars were not a single campaign. They were a grinding, 30-year confrontation, series of raids and counter-raids, sieges and broken sieges, armies marching through the Derbent corridor in summer and retreating before the snow closed the passes in autumn. The Arabs advanced. The Khazars pushed them back. The Arabs came again with larger forces. The Khazars retreated into the steppe, drawing the Arab columns deeper into unfamiliar terrain, then wheeled around and struck. This was steppe warfare in its most lethal form, and the Arab Chronicles, written by men from Damascus and Baghdad, who had never felt wind that could freeze a horse in its tracks, described the Khazar raids with a tone of genuine dread. In 730, the Khazar commander, known in the sources only by his title, the Khagan's deputy, because the Khagan himself was a sacral figure who did not lead armies, launched a counter-invasion so devastating that it reached deep into Muslim territory. The Khazar cavalry crossed the mountains, bypassed Derbent, and swept through Albania, not the Balkan Albania, but Caucasian Albania, a Christian kingdom under Arab suzerainty north of the Araxes River. They took the city of Ardabil. They crushed an Arab army sent to stop them. According to the chronicler Al-Tabari, the Khazars killed the Arab governor and carried off thousands of captives. For a moment, it looked as though the entire Muslim position in the Caucasus might collapse. The Caliphate could not ignore this. The Umayyad response was entrusted to Marwan ibn Muhammad, a cousin of the reigning Caliph Hisham, a hardened general who had been fighting on multiple fronts for years. Marwan was not a man given to theatrical gestures. He was methodical, relentless, and he understood that the Khazars could not be defeated by chasing them across the steppe. He needed to bring them to battle on ground of his choosing. He assembled one of the largest armies the Caliphate had ever committed to the Caucasus front. Arab regulars, Syrian heavy infantry, Armenian levies, and a baggage train that stretched for miles. In the summer of 732, he marched north through the Derbent corridor. The Khazar army withdrew ahead of him, refusing battle, burning the grass, fouling the wells. Standard steppe tactics against an invader. Marwan kept coming. He crossed the Terek River. He pushed deeper into Khazar territory than any Arab commander had ever gone. Then he realized what the Khazars were doing. They were not retreating. They were positioning. The Khagan's deputy had concentrated his forces on high ground near the river, and when Marwan's columns were stretched out along the line of march, tired, strung out, their cavalry horses blown, the Khazars struck. Arab sources described the attack as a thunderbolt. Khazar heavy cavalry, armoured riders on armoured horses, crashed into the Arab vanguard and shattered it. Light horse archers circled the flanks, pouring arrows into the infantry squares. The Arab army, one of the largest field forces the Umayyads ever deployed in the north, broke apart. Marwan himself barely escaped. His losses were catastrophic. The Khazars pursued the survivors south through the passes, and by the time Marwan regrouped in Muslim territory, his army had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The scale of this defeat is hard to overstate. The Umayyad Caliphate had been humiliated in battle before. The failed siege of Constantinople in 718 was still fresh in living memory, but those defeats had occurred at the far edges of the Islamic world, against walled cities and imperial navies. This was a field engagement against a steppe power, and the Caliphate's best general had been routed. The Caucasus front went quiet. For years afterward, Arab sources are almost silent about the north. Edward Gibbon, writing 1,000 years later in his Great History of Rome, looked at these events and made a judgment that still startles. The Khazar victory, he wrote, was one of the events that determined whether Europe would become Islamic. The statement has been debated ever since. Was the Khazar bulwark truly the decisive factor, or did the Caliphate overextend itself so far from its centre that defeat was inevitable? The truth lies somewhere in the tension. The Khazars were not the only barrier. The Byzantine Empire still held Anatolia and was fighting its own desperate defensive wars. The Umayyad Caliphate was beginning to fracture internally. The Abbasid revolution that would overthrow the dynasty was already brewing in Khorasan, and the vast distances of the empire made sustained campaigns on multiple fronts almost impossible. But structure matters as much as contingent events. The Caucasus passes were the only direct overland route from the Islamic world into the plains north of the Black Sea. If the Khazars had collapsed in 732, if Marwan had broken through, seized the Volga Delta, and turned Khazar territory into a forward base for further expansion, there was no other organized military power between the Caliphate and the forests of Poland. No kingdom, no confederation, no walls. The Slavs of the Dnieper region were still paying tribute to the Khazars and had no capacity to resist an Arab army. The Magyars had not yet migrated into the Carpathian Basin. The Franks under Charles Martel were 1,200 miles to the west, far beyond any possible line of reinforcement. The Khazars did not merely slow Islamic expansion into Eastern Europe. They blocked the door entirely, and they held it shut while the political geography of the West was still taking shape. That is not a conclusion historians universally endorse. Some scholars point out that Marwan ibn Muhammad eventually recovered from his defeat, and that he later mounted counter-campaigns into Khazar territory that recovered some of the lost ground. The war did not end in 732. It sputtered on for another 5 years, with both sides raiding and counter-raiding, until a negotiated settlement established a fragile peace. The argument that the Caliphate was already overstretched has real weight. The Khazar victory may have been necessary for halting the northern advance, but was it sufficient? Harder to prove, but Gibbon's line endures because it captures something the counter-arguments tend to miss. The year 732 was unhinged. In the west, Charles Martel had just turned back an Arab raiding party at Tours, a battle that entered European mythology as the moment Christendom was saved. Even though the force Charles faced was a modest expeditionary column. In the east, at roughly the same time, a far larger Arab army had been annihilated by a Jewish-ruled steppe empire, and the event vanished from Western memory almost completely. The Khazars held the Caucasus passes for another 2 centuries after their victory. Muslim armies never again threatened to break through into the grasslands of what is now Ukraine. The trade routes stayed open, the silver kept flowing north, and the religious map of Eastern Europe, the map that would eventually produce Orthodox Russia, Catholic Poland, and the whole contest borderland between them, was being drawn in part by the simple fact that a Turkic cavalry commander, whose name we do not know, won a battle in a mountain pass that most people cannot find on a map. That is the strange weight of military geography. One narrow corridor between sea and mountain, one army that held it, one summer of blood in a place that even the chroniclers of the age barely bothered to describe, because the chroniclers lived in Baghdad and Damascus and Constantinople, and the northern steppe was a blank space on their mental maps, a darkness beyond the mountains where strange peoples did strange things, and nobody of importance lived. Nobody of importance. The Khazars knew better, and for 300 years the geography agreed with them. A raid is a language. A trade agreement is a language. A marriage alliance is a language. Every state in the medieval world spoke to its neighbours through signals. Threats of force, offers of profit, promises of blood connection. But by the middle of the 8th century, the two superpowers that flanked the Khazar Empire had begun to speak a new language, one that made all the old signals obsolete. They had begun to speak God. The Byzantine Empire was Christian, the Umayyad Caliphate, and after 750, the Abbasid Caliphate that replaced it, was Muslim. Both empires now understood themselves not merely as political entities, but as instruments of divine will. Their emperors and caliphs claimed to rule on behalf of the one true faith. Their diplomats arrived in foreign courts accompanied by priests and imams. Their treaties assumed that a subordinate ruler would eventually accept the religion of his protector. To be a vassal of Byzantium meant sooner or later to be baptized. To be a client of the caliphate meant sooner or later to submit to Islam. The Khazars looked at this map and understood something that few peoples in their position ever had the clarity to see. If they accepted Christianity, they would become a dependency of Constantinople. If they accepted Islam, they would become a province of Baghdad. Either choice would dissolve their independence into someone else's empire, someone else's holy war, someone else's claim to universal rule. There was a third option. Sometime between 740 and 800 AD, the exact date is lost, the precise sequence of events unrecoverable. The Khagan of the Khazars made a decision that had no precedent in the medieval world. He and his inner court converted to Judaism, not to Christianity, not to Islam, to the one faith that had no empire, no army, no caliph or emperor demanding the obedience of kings. The faith of a scattered people who had been conquered by Romans, Persians, Byzantines, and Arabs in turn, and who had somehow survived all of them. The primary source that preserves this story is a document known as the Shekhter Letter, a Hebrew text discovered in the late 19th century in the Cairo Geniza, a storeroom in an ancient synagogue where worn-out manuscripts were deposited rather than destroyed because they contained the name of God. The letter dates from the 10th century, roughly 200 years after the events it describes, and it was written by a Khazar Jew who was clearly trying to explain his people's origins to a correspondent in the wider Jewish world. The narrative it contains reads less like a dry chronicle and more like a carefully constructed foundation myth, but beneath the storytelling conventions lies a core of historical truth that no serious scholar now disputes. The Khazar elite did convert. The Shekhter Letter, however embellished, is the closest thing we have to their own account of why. According to the letter, the Khagan summoned representatives of the three major faiths to his court. The setting would have been the palace complex in Itil, timber halls hung with silk, braziers burning against the vulgar damp. The Khagan himself elevated on a dais, veiled in the Turkic custom that marked him as semi-divine. Before him stood a Christian priest, a Muslim Qadi, and a Jewish rabbi. The Khagan asked each of them the same question: which of your faiths is the oldest? The priest answered that the faith of Jesus fulfilled the ancient law of Moses, that Christianity was therefore both old and new, the completion of what had come before. The Qadi answered that Islam was the final revelation, the seal of the prophets, the last and most perfect word of God to humanity. The rabbi answered differently. He said that Judaism was the root. The other two were branches that had grown from it. Christianity and Islam had borrowed their God, their prophets, their moral law, their very sense of history from the faith of Israel. Without Judaism, neither of them could claim any legitimacy at all. The Khagan listened. He asked the priest a follow-up question. If you had to choose between Islam and Judaism, which would you consider the truer faith? The priest, according to the Shekhter Letter, answered without hesitation: Judaism. The God of the Jews was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Torah was divinely revealed. Whatever he believed about Jesus, he could not deny that the foundation of his own religion was Jewish. The Khagan then asked the Qadi the same question: Islam or Judaism? The Qadi gave the same answer: Judaism. The Quran itself acknowledged the Torah as revelation. The children of Israel were the original people of the book. The Khagan looked at both of them and spoke words that the Shekhter Letter records with devastating simplicity. You have admitted, both of you, that the faith of Israel is the root of your own. I choose the root. It is a superb story. It may even be substantially true. But we should be careful not to mistake a narrative crafted for theological self-justification. Written 2 centuries after the fact by a Khazar Jew who wanted to demonstrate that his people had chosen wisely. For a transcript of what actually happened in that timber hall, the Shekhter Letter is not a court record. It is an argument dressed as a story. The Khagan may or may not have staged a formal disputation. He may or may not have asked exactly those questions. What we can say with confidence is that the logic the story presents, The logic of choosing a faith that stood outside both imperial power structures corresponds exactly to the strategic position the Khazars occupied, because here is the political calculus that the Shechtaletter's elegant narrative tends to obscure. Judaism in the 8th century was not a faith that could project military power. It had no caliph, it had no emperor, it had no armies marching under its banner, no fleets blockading its enemies' ports, no treasury that could fund proxy wars or bribe foreign officials. To convert to Judaism was, from the perspective of either Constantinople or Baghdad, an act of almost incomprehensible strangeness. It placed the Khagan outside the entire framework of Christian-Islamic rivalry. He was not choosing the enemy's god. He was choosing a god neither empire could claim to control. The political effect was immediate and durable. The Khazars were no longer a potential prize to be won by whichever superpower converted their ruler first. They were a permanent third party, aligned with neither, hostile to neither, capable of trading with both. The conversion functioned as a declaration of sovereignty that was also, paradoxically, a declaration of neutrality. We will not be absorbed. We will not be subordinated. We will not become a province of your holy war. The next question is the one that has generated more argument than any other in Khazar studies. How deep did the conversion go? The answer, as far as the evidence allows us to see it, is that it did not go deep at all. The Khagan and his inner court converted. The nobility, or at least a significant portion of it, followed. The state began using Hebrew script for official documents. The king's correspondence with foreign Jewish communities, most famously the letters exchanged with Hasdai ibn Shaprat of Cordoba in the 10th century, employed the language and self-presentation of a Jewish ruler addressing fellow Jews. By the time Muslim travellers like al-Masudi visited Itil in the 10th century, they reported that the Khazar king was Jewish and that his court observed Jewish law. But the population of the Khazar Empire at its height numbered in the hundreds of thousands, possibly millions. They were a patchwork of Turks, Slavs, Goths, Alans, Bulgars and Finnic tribes. They spoke dozens of languages. They worshipped an enormous range of gods, and the Khagan never attempted to make them Jewish. This is the detail that separates the Khazar conversion from the conversions that reshaped Europe in the same period. When Clovis, king of the Franks, converted to Christianity in the late 5th century, his people followed. When Vladimir of Kiev accepted Orthodox Christianity in 988, the Rus were baptized en masse. Religious conversion in medieval state building was almost always top-down, imposed by rulers on subjects, often with considerable violence. The Khazars did not do this. Ibn Rusta, the Arab geographer who visited Itil in the early 10th century, describes a city with separate quarters for Jews, Muslims, Christians and pagans, each governed by its own courts and its own laws. The 7 judges he counted were not a theoretical arrangement. They were the practical machinery of a state that decided, quite consciously, that religious uniformity was less important than commercial stability. If you forced your Muslim merchants to convert, they would leave and take their silver dirhams with them. If you forced your Christian traders to abandon their faith, they would migrate to Byzantine territory. If you tried to impose Judaism on the pagan tribes who supplied your furs and your honey and your wax, they would stop paying tribute and melt back into the forest. The Khagan's Judaism was a faith of the ruling house. It was not a missionary project. The ordinary Khazar subject, the farmer on the Don, the fisherman on the Volga, the herder driving his flocks across the summer steppe, probably lived and died without ever setting foot in a synagogue. He may have known that his king was a Jew, in the same way he knew that the emperor in Constantinople was a Christian and the caliph in Baghdad was a Muslim. It would have been a fact about the world, not a fact about himself. This limited, pragmatic approach to religion is one of the reasons the Khazar Empire endured as long as it did. Most multi-ethnic empires in history have been held together either by brute force or by a unifying ideology, a single faith, a single dynasty, a single myth of origin. The Khazars attempted something rarer. They built a state that did not require its subjects to believe the same thing, only to pay the same taxes, obey the same laws, and defend the same borders. The empire at its height, between roughly 750 and 950 AD, was not held together by a single faith or a single ethnicity. It was held together by something rarer, a system. The Khazar state at its zenith controlled a territory that stretched from the northern slopes of the Caucasus Mountains to the forested headwaters of the Don and Dnieper rivers, and from the Crimean Peninsula in the west to the Caspian Sea in the east. 500,000 square kilometers or more. Within those borders lived Turks, Slavs, Goths, Alans, Bulgars, Finnic tribes, and peoples whose names no written record has preserved. They spoke mutually incomprehensible languages. They worshipped different gods. They had no shared history, no common origin story, no unifying cultural tradition. And yet, for 2 centuries, this patchwork of peoples cohered into one of the most stable political entities in the medieval world. The question is how. Part of the answer lies in geography. The Khazar heartland sat astride the great river systems of the Volga and the Don, which functioned as the arterial highways of Eurasian trade. Goods moving from China to Europe, or from the Islamic world to Scandinavia, had to pass through Khazar-controlled waterways or pay Khazar tolls to use alternative routes. The empire was, in effect, a giant toll booth placed across the most lucrative trade corridors of the hemisphere. But a toll booth is not a state. The Khazars understood that controlling trade routes and profiting from trade routes were 2 different things. The first required soldiers. The second required something more difficult. It required making merchants want to come to you. The system did not attempt to extract maximum revenue from every possible source. It attempted to calibrate demands to the specific characteristics of each population under its control, maximizing long-term stability rather than short-term profit. This is not how extractive empires usually behave. Extractive empires squeeze until the subjects break. The Khazars squeezed just enough to grow rich, and not enough to make rebellion worth the cost. The tribute system tells the same story from a different angle. By the 9th century, the Khazars collected regular payments from a wide arc of subordinate peoples. The Volga Bulgars, a Turkic group settled around the confluence of the Volga and Kama rivers, paid tribute in furs. Finnic tribes in the northern forests delivered honey, wax, and the pelts of sable and marten. Various East Slavic groups, the ancestors of what would become the Kievan Rus, supplied grain, livestock, and on occasion slaves captured in intertribal warfare. The tribute was not onerous. The subject peoples retained their own leaders, their own customs, and in most cases their own religions. They were not annexed. They were not colonized. They were not forcibly assimilated. They simply paid what the Khazars asked, and in return they received access to Khazar markets, protection from Khazar cavalry, and the right to participate in a trading network that stretched from China to the Atlantic. It was, for most of them, a better deal than the alternatives, because the alternatives were real. The steppe was not a vacuum. Peoples who fell outside the Khazar orbit fell into the orbit of someone else. The Pechenegs, the Magyars, the various Turkic confederations that rose and fell on the open grasslands, these were not gentle overlords. The Khazars, for all their military reputation, governed their dependencies with a light hand. The tribute was the price of stability, and for 2 centuries, most of the subject peoples calculated that the price was worth paying. The diplomatic machinery that sustained this system is harder to reconstruct from the surviving sources, but the broad outlines are clear. The Khazar court at Itil maintained regular contact with the Byzantine Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate, and the emerging Kievan Rus state. Embassies travelled in both directions. Gifts were exchanged. Marriage alliances were proposed and sometimes concluded. The Khagan's chancery, staffed by scribes who wrote in Hebrew script, produced correspondence that reached Jewish communities as far away as Córdoba in Islamic Spain, where the statesman Hasdai ibn Shaprut heard rumours of a Jewish kingdom and sent a letter of inquiry that still survives. The palace complex at Itil, when a foreign ambassador arrived, would have presented a carefully calibrated face. The Khagan himself appeared only rarely, and when he did, he was veiled. The day-to-day business of receiving envoys, negotiating treaties, and managing the flow of information fell to his deputy, a figure the Arab sources call the Bek. The division of labour was deliberate. The Hagan was sacred. The Bek was practical. The ambassador who came seeking trade concessions or military coordination dealt with the Bek. The ambassador, who wanted to be awed by the mystique of Khazar kingship, was granted a glimpse of the veiled Khagan, enthroned in a hall hung with silk, and then sent on his way. This was statecraft as theatre, and it worked because the Khazars understood that power is partly what you can do, and partly what people believe you can do. The Bek ran the empire. The Khagan embodied it. Between them, they projected an image of a state that was simultaneously reachable and untouchable, available for negotiation and beyond the reach of ordinary politics. The system was not perfect. No system is. There were succession disputes, although we know few of their details. There were moments when tribute payments were late or refused, and Khazar cavalry had to ride out to make a point. There were tensions between the religious communities in Itil, carefully managed but never fully resolved. The machinery creaked, but it did not break. For 200 years it did not break, and during those 2 centuries, The Khazar Empire did something that few states in history have managed to do for more than a generation or two. It governed a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual population without attempting to make them all the same. It extracted revenue without provoking rebellion. It projected military power without bankrupting its treasury. It maintained diplomatic relations with enemies who were at war with each other, and it did so without becoming anyone's permanent ally or anyone's permanent enemy. The empire was, in the most literal sense, a world between worlds, between Europe and Asia, between Christendom and Islam, between the steppe and the Saône, between the age of the ancient empires and the age of the nation-states that would eventually replace them. What held it together was not faith, it was not ethnicity, it was not a charismatic dynasty or a unifying ideology. It was a system that worked, and then, in the second half of the 10th century, it stopped working. The Volga Delta in late August, the heat rising off the reeds, the air thick with midges. A team of archaeologists has been here for 3 weeks, taking core samples, running ground-penetrating radar over ground that satellite imagery flagged as anomalous. They have found nothing, not a wall, not a potsherd, and also a square metre of soil that says unequivocally, a city stood here. Somewhere beneath this flat, wet, silent landscape lies the capital of an empire that ruled 500,000 square kilometres for 300 years. Descriptions of Itil survive in multiple languages. Arab geographers walked its streets and counted its judges. Khazar kings received embassies in its halls. Merchants from Baghdad, Constantinople, and the Baltic traded silver and silk and slaves in its markets. And yet no one on earth can tell you precisely where it was. The accounts are not vague. Al-Masudi, writing in the 940s, describes a city spread across both banks of a major river, connected by a bridge of boats. The eastern half housed the Khagan's palace, the court quarters, and the Jewish community. The western half contained the Muslim quarter, with its own mosques, bathhouses, and madrasas, alongside the neighbourhoods of Christians, pagans, and the foreign merchants who came for the season and sometimes stayed. Ibn Rusta, who visited around the same time, tallied the judges, described the markets, noted the tithe levied on rush ships in the harbour. Al-Istakri added that the city rebuilt itself repeatedly after fires and floods, because its wealth was too great to abandon. These men did not hallucinate. They were part of a sophisticated Islamic geographical tradition that valued accuracy. They had seen other cities and could compare. The Itil they described was larger than any city in Western Europe at the time, somewhere between 50,000 and several 100,000 souls. It had a permanent harbour. It had organised taxation. It had a skyline of minarets, synagogue domes, and the timber towers of the Khagan's compound. Smoke rising from 100 kitchen fires, the sound of shipwrights hammering on the docks. And then, after the Rus sack in the 960s, it slipped from view. Not dramatically, not overnight, but gradually, over decades and centuries, the city ceased to appear in travellers' reports. No successor settlement ever rose on exactly the same spot. The name Itil survived only as a river designation, not a place, a genetics laboratory in the 21st century. Fluorescent light, the hum of sequencing machines, a technician in gloves pipetting solution into a plate that holds the concentrated essence of thousands of years of human migration. Somewhere in those wells is a signal that may or may not trace back to the Khazars. The question is simple. Do modern Ashkenazi Jews descend substantially from the Turkic converts of a steppe empire that collapsed 1,000 years ago? Simple question, explosive answer. And for 50 years, that answer has been fought over with an intensity that has nothing to do with science, and everything to do with who gets to claim a piece of the past. The controversy begins for most people with a book, 1976. Arthur Koestler, a Hungarian-born Jewish intellectual who had fled the Nazis, fought in the Spanish Civil War, and written the anti-Stalinist novel Darkness at Noon, publishes The 13th Tribe. Koestler is dying of leukemia. He will take his own life in 1983. This book, he knows, may be his last major statement. Koestler was not a historian. He was not a geneticist. He was a polymath journalist with a gift for connecting dots that academics hesitated to connect. And the dots he connected in the 13th tribe were these. The Khazar Empire converted to Judaism in the 8th century. The Khazar Empire collapsed in the 10th. Where did its Jewish population go? Koestler's answer: westward, into Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, into the demographic pool that would become Ashkenazi Jewry. His thesis carried a political payload. If Ashkenazi Jews were largely descended from Khazar converts, then they were not Semitic in origin, they were Turkic. Their ancestral connection to the land of Israel was, at minimum, thinner than claimed. The Nazi racial laws that had defined Jews as a Semitic race had, in Koestler's ironic formulation, persecuted the wrong people. Anti-Semitism was not just evil, it was factually misdirected. Koestler genuinely believed this argument would defang anti-Semitism. He was spectacularly wrong. The book was immediately seized upon by neo-Nazi groups, by Arab nationalist propagandists, by anyone who wanted to argue that European Jews were interlopers with no legitimate claim to the Middle East. Koestler spent his final years watching his thesis become a cudgel. But was the thesis true? For decades, nobody could say. The tools did not exist. Historians argued from documents, the Khazar correspondence, the Schechter letter, the Arab geographers. But documents cannot tell you how many Khazar Jews migrated west, or whether they constituted a demographic trickle or a flood. The silence of the archaeological record was total. No Khazar cemetery has ever been definitively identified. No Khazar bones have spoken. Then, in 2013, a geneticist named Aaron Elhaik published a paper in Genome Biology and Evolution that detonated the debate all over again. Elhaik, then at Johns Hopkins, claimed to have found a Khazar genetic signal in modern Ashkenazi populations. His method compared Ashkenazi genomes with those of modern Caucasus populations, Armenians, Georgians, Azerbaijanis, whom he used as proxies for the ancient Khazars. The signal, he argued, was unmistakable. The Khazar contribution to Ashkenazi ancestry was substantial. The 13th tribe thesis had in his telling received scientific vindication. The reaction was immediate and polarizing. Newspapers ran headlines about the Khazar hypothesis confirmed. Anti-Zionist activists celebrated. Jewish communal organizations denounced the study as flawed and politically motivated, and geneticists began picking apart the methodology. The core problem was the proxy. Elhaik had selected modern Caucasus populations to represent the Khazars, but no one knows who the modern descendants of the Khazars are, if any exist. The Khazars absorbed Alan, Bulgar, Slavic and Gothic populations over centuries. Their ruling elite was Turkic, but the empire was multi-ethnic. Choosing Armenians or Georgians as a Khazar stand-in was speculative at best, circular at worst. Subsequent reanalyses found that Elhaik's result depended heavily on which statistical assumptions were baked into the model. Change the assumptions, change the result. By 2015, multiple teams had published rebuttals arguing that the Khazar signal was a methodological artifact, a ghost in the machine. Meanwhile, the mainstream of population genetics had been building a different picture. Studies led by Michael Hammer, Marta Costa, and others examined mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed exclusively from mother to child. Their finding, replicated across multiple cohorts, was that Ashkenazi maternal lineages are overwhelmingly Near Eastern in origin. The majority trace back to a small group of women who lived in the Mediterranean basin 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. The Khazar contribution to the female line appears negligible. The male line, carried on the Y chromosome, tells a more complex story. There is a substantial European admixture, likely from intermarriage over centuries in Italy, the Rhineland, and later Poland. But the Near Eastern signal is still dominant, and the specific markers that would indicate a large-scale Turkic influx from the Caspian steppe, absent or too faint to distinguish from statistical noise. By 2018, the academic consensus had hardened. The Khazar hypothesis as a demographic explanation for Ashkenazi origins was treated as marginal, not impossible, not disproved in the strictest sense. Genetics cannot prove a negative, but unsupported by the best available evidence. The weight of the data pointed to a Levantine origin for Ashkenazi Jewry, with European admixture accumulating through migration and marriage over 2 millennia. If this were an ordinary historical question, the genetic evidence might have settled the matter. It is not an ordinary historical question. The Khazar thesis has become one of the most politically weaponized ideas in modern identity discourse. Anti-Zionist activists use it to argue that Ashkenazi Jews are not indigenous to the Middle East, and therefore have no claim to a state there. Some Palestinian advocacy groups cite Koestler as though he were a primary source. Far-right movements in Europe and America embrace the thesis because it separates Jews from the biblical narrative that underpins Christian Zionism. Turkic nationalists in Tatarstan and Azerbaijan claim Khazar ancestry as a point of pride, sometimes asserting that Ashkenazi Jews are essentially Turkic cousins. Some Jewish nationalists, in turn, avoid the Khazar topic entirely, not because the evidence is threatening, but because even discussing it feels like lending legitimacy to a bad faith argument. The irony is sharp. The Khazars in their own time were defined by their strategic refusal to align with either Christendom or Islam, 1,000 years later, their ghosts are drafted into wars of identity they never could have imagined, and beneath the politics, a quieter tragedy. The genetic controversy has obscured the historical Khazars almost as thoroughly as the shifting Volga Delta buried Itil. People argue about what Khazar blood means for modern Jews, but almost nobody asks what the conversion meant to the Khazars themselves. What it felt like to be a steppe cavalryman learning Hebrew prayers. What it cost a merchant family to keep kosher on the Silk Road. Whether a Jewish Khazar mother, watching her children grow up in the twilight years of the empire, believed they would be remembered. The machines in the laboratory do not answer those questions. They only return strings of nucleotides, statistical probabilities, the cold arithmetic of ancestry. The rest is silence. The man who destroyed the Khazar Empire was not a caliph, not a Byzantine emperor. He was a prince of the Rus, a people who, a century earlier, had been paying tribute to the Khazars in fur and slaves. Sviatoslav of Kiev was by the standards of any age a fighter. The primary chronicle describes him as lean, with a shaved head, a single lock of hair falling from his crown, a gold ring in one ear. He slept on the ground with a saddle under his head. He ate meat roasted directly over a campfire. When he went to war, he did not sneak. He sent a messenger ahead with 4 words, "I am coming at you." In the 960s, he turned that message south. The Khazar Empire by this point had stood for 3 centuries. Its heavy cavalry had shattered the Umayyad advance. Its capital governed trade between China and Scandinavia. Its Khagan still rode beneath silk, veiled from common sight, a living symbol of sacral power. But power that has lasted 3 centuries can be hollow in places people do not see. Sviatoslav saw. The Rus had grown from scattered river traders into a principality with military ambition and access to the same north-south river arteries the Khazars controlled. The Volga and the Don were more than trade routes. They were invasion highways. Whoever moved fastest along them dictated the terms. Sviatoslav moved fast. His first target was not Itil. It was Sarkel, the limestone fortress on the lower Don River, built by the Khazars with Byzantine engineering assistance decades earlier. Sarkel was the northern gate of the empire, the hard point that controlled traffic between the Black Sea steppe and the Volga heartland. Its walls were thick. Its garrison was experienced. It had never fallen to an attacker. The Rus came down the Don in longships, shallow draft vessels that could navigate rivers too thin for larger craft. They carried axes, swords, and the kind of fury that medieval chroniclers struggled to describe without invoking divine punishment. The siege of Sarkel was not prolonged. The fortress fell. The primary chronicle does not linger on the details of that fight, but the result is unambiguous. The northern gate was smashed open. Above the Don, autumn light catching smoke from burning watchtowers, the road to Itil lay undefended. Sviatoslav did not pause. He pushed east toward the Volga Delta, toward the city that had grown larger than any in Western Europe, toward the harbour where Islamic silver and northern fur changed hands, and the 7 judges heard cases under their separate laws. What his army found when they reached Itil is a matter of some dispute. Not the fact of destruction, but the timing. The primary chronicle places the sack in 965. Several Arab sources point to 969. The discrepancy may reflect a multi-year campaign with waves of assault. It may reflect the simple chaos of an empire's last days, when record-keeping collapses alongside armies. Either way, the end when it came was absolute. The chronicle records what happened with the brief brutality that characterizes all its battle passages. The Rus killed the Khazars in their streets. They burned the synagogues. They took the women and children into slavery. The separate quarters, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, pagan, all burned the same. Fire does not respect jurisdictional boundaries. Visualize this not as a battle, but as an unraveling. A city whose existence depended on the flow of trade and the credible threat of Khazar cavalry. The cavalry had been broken at Sarkel, or outmaneuvered, or simply could not concentrate fast enough to meet a river-borne assault that moved at the speed of the current. Without the army, Itil was a marketplace. Markets do not fight. The harbour that had received ships from the land of the Rus for 2 centuries, the same ships from which the Khazars had extracted their tithe, now disgorged armed men instead of merchants. The goods that normally flowed in both directions were seized where they lay. Silk from China, silver dirhams from Samara, fur bundles from the far northern forests, all of it became plunder. The commercial logic that had sustained the Khazar state for 300 years was, in a matter of days, reduced to what could be carried away in a longship. The Rus did not attempt to govern Itil. They did not install an administrator or demand tribute. They took what was valuable, killed what resisted, and burned what remained. Then they left the smouldering delta behind them and turned west, toward other conquests. The Khazar military machine did not recover. The army that had once routed an Umayyad prince and held the Caucasus passes for generations simply ceased to function as a coherent force. Some units may have fought on in isolated garrisons. Others dissolved into the steppe, absorbed by neighbouring peoples whose names would survive while Khazar did not. The trade routes that had funded the empire were no longer under Khazar control. The Volga and the Don, those essential arteries, now belonged to whoever was strong enough to patrol them. The Rus had demonstrated that the Khazars no longer were. Sviatoslav himself did not stop to survey the ruin. He had other wars to fight, against the Bulgars, against the Byzantines, against anyone whose territory could be reached by river and blade. He would die a few years later, ambushed by Pyrenees nomads on the Dnieper. His skull would be made into a drinking cup, which is the kind of detail medieval chroniclers include when they want you to understand that violence, in that world, was not an interruption of normal life, but its governing rhythm. For the Khazar Empire, the sack of Sarkel and Itil was the wound from which no recovery was possible. The Khagan still lived. Sviatoslav had not yet captured him, but a Khagan without an army and a capital was a symbol without a body. The state that had balanced between two worlds, that had chosen a third faith to avoid subordination to either, that had governed through commerce and law rather than conversion and conquest, was now a carcass on the steppe. The bones were still warm, but the scavengers were already gathering. Within a generation, the territory that had been the Khazar heartland would be divided among Rus princes, Kipchak nomads, and the rising powers of the Caucasus. The name Khazar would fade from diplomatic correspondence. The memory of a Jewish empire north of the mountains would become something merchants told each other on long journeys and listeners half believed. What remained was ash on the Volga, a broken fortress on the Don, and one more thing, a prisoner, the Khagan himself, captured alive, waiting to face the prince who had just erased his world. That encounter, when it came, would be something rarer than a military defeat. It would be a theological argument conducted at sword point. The Khagan had never been seen by most of his own subjects. For 3 centuries, the supreme ruler of the Khazar Empire appeared in public only behind a veil of silk, carried on a litter, elevated above the gaze of ordinary men. This was not vanity, it was theology. In the Turkic tradition the Khazars inherited, the ruler was not merely a political figure. He was a vessel. The fortune of the entire people flowed through his body. His health was the health of the state. If he grew weak, the grass would wither. If he died wrongly, the sky itself might turn against his people. Now he stood in front of Sviatoslav of Kiev, unveiled, in the smoking ruin of everything he had been raised to protect. We do not know exactly where the capture happened. The primary chronicle does not give us the geography, only the encounter. But the logic of the campaign suggests it was somewhere near the Volga, perhaps in the delta itself, perhaps on the riverbank, while the fires of Itil still burned behind them. The Rus had swept through the capital with the speed of men who did not intend to stay. They had taken prisoners, loaded their ships, and somewhere in the chaos they found the Khagan, not dead, not escaped, present. The man who had once been the symbolic centre of an empire that stretched from the Caucasus to the Ukrainian steppe was now a captive. His guards were dead or scattered. His court had fled or burned. The silk veil that marked his sacred status was torn, or lost, or deliberately stripped from him. Sviatoslav looked at this man, this symbol, and asked a question. Where is your god now? You have to understand the cruelty in that question. Sviatoslav was a pagan. He worshipped the gods of the Rus, the thunder and the river spirits, the ancestors whose names we no longer have. He did not ask about the Khagan's god out of theological curiosity. He asked because he had just burned the synagogues of Itil. He had just killed the rabbis who taught that the God of Israel was the God of all nations. He had just demonstrated, with fire and steel, that the Khazar god had not protected his people. The question was a blade. It was meant to humiliate. It was meant to force the Khagan to admit that his faith was hollow, that his conversion had been a mistake, that the God he had chosen over Christ and over the prophet was absent when it mattered most. The Khagan answered, "He is where he always was. You cannot burn him." No pleading, no bargaining, no attempt to save his life by renouncing his faith. The man who had been raised behind silk, who had never been seen, who had been treated as something between a king and a spirit, that man, stripped and bound and facing his own death, delivered a theological statement that has survived for 1,000 years. He did not argue. He did not explain. He simply asserted that the fire that had consumed the synagogues had not touched God, that the army that had shattered his empire had not defeated the one he worshipped, that Sviatoslav's victory was real but limited. You can kill a king, you can burn a city, you cannot burn the root. The Rus prince did not debate. He gave the order. They beheaded the Khagan. Then, in a gesture that would have been understood by everyone who witnessed it, Sviatoslav had the body placed on a raft and set adrift down the Volga toward the Caspian Sea. This was not a burial. This was not an execution followed by the dignity of a grave. This was ritual destruction. The raft carried no goods, no offerings, no companions for the afterlife. It carried only a corpse, drifting downstream through the territory that had once been the heart of the Khazar realm, past the charred harbour, past the broken markets, toward a sea that touched no Khazar shore anymore. The meaning was unmistakable. The Khagan was not being sent to his ancestors. He was being erased. His body would not rest in Khazar earth. His spirit would not receive the rights that Turkic tradition demanded for its sacred kings. The connection between the ruler, the land, and the people was being severed with an axe stroke and a length of river current. Sviatoslav understood what he was destroying. The Khagan was not a military commander. He had never led cavalry charges or planned campaigns. His power was not tactical, it was sacramental. As long as the Khagan lived, the Khazar state had a centre. It had a point around which resistance could organise, a name that could rally fugitives, a symbol that could gather whatever fragments of the army remained. By killing the Khagan in this specific way, publicly, contemptuously, with theological mockery, Sviatoslav was doing more than removing a man. He was extinguishing the office. He was demonstrating to every Khazar survivor, and to every neighbouring people who heard the story, that the sacred kingship was gone, that the god who had supposedly chosen the Khagan had not saved him, that the empire was not merely defeated, it was unmade. The raft drifted out of sight. The current took it east and south toward water that would carry no memory. With that single execution, the Khazar state lost its last irreducible component. Armies can be rebuilt. Trade routes can be re-established. Fortresses can be reconstructed, given time and resources. But a sacral kingship, once broken, does not regenerate. The Khagan had been the living link between the people and the divine, the figure whose legitimacy was not earned through conquest, but inherited through blood and ritual. When Sviatoslav cut off his head and set his body adrift, he cut that link permanently. The Khazar Empire could not recover because the Khazar Empire had been, in its deepest logic, a person, not a territory, not a treasury, not even an army, a person. The Khagan was the state, and the state had just floated away on a river toward a sea under a sky that did not answer. What remained of the Khazar world would fragment and dissolve in the years that followed. Some Khazar fighters would appear again, decades later, fighting alongside the Cumans against the Mongols. Some Khazar communities would persist in the mountains of the Caucasus, holding to their Jewish faith in isolation. Some, perhaps, would drift westward, into the forests of Poland and Lithuania, carrying with them stories that their grandchildren would no longer recognize as their own. But the empire itself was finished, not because the cities were burned. Cities can be rebuilt. Not because the trade routes were lost. Routes shift and return. The empire was finished because the symbolic center had been publicly, ritually annihilated. The Khagan, who had been the living embodiment of Khazar sovereignty, was dead, and the manner of his death had proven, in the logic of that world, that his sovereignty had been false, or at least that it could not survive contact with a man who worshipped different gods and sharper blades. The last image of the Khazar Empire is not a battle. It is a beheading, and then a raft, small against the vast brown water of the Volga, carrying a body toward a sea that has no memory. The Khagan's words, not Sviatoslav's sword, are what survived. The raft vanished downstream. The Khagan was dead. But the Khazar people did not simply evaporate. Empires collapse in days. Peoples dissolve over centuries. The Rus army that burned Itil did not occupy the territory. Sviatoslav had no interest in governing the Volga Delta. He had come for plunder and strategic destruction, not administration. His fleet loaded its cargo, silver, slaves, whatever could be carried, and returned north to Kiev. Behind them, the Khazar state lay broken. No central authority remained, no tax collectors, no military command, no postal system. The elaborate machinery that had held 500,000 square kilometres together for 3 centuries had been smashed in a single campaign season. But the people who had lived inside that machinery were still there. Farmers along the Don, fishermen in the Volga Delta, traders who had worked the caravan routes, Jewish communities in the cities, Muslim merchants who had paid their tithes and prospered, Christian families whose grandparents had converted under Byzantine influence generations earlier. pagan tribes who had always existed at the edges of Khazar control, paying tribute when the Khagan was strong, ignoring him when he was not. All of them now faced the same question. With the empire gone, who were they? Some answers came quickly. The Volga Bulgars, who had been Khazar tributaries for 2 centuries, simply declared independence. They had already been drifting toward Islam, building connections with Baghdad that bypassed Khazar middlemen entirely. Within a generation, Volga Bulgaria was a functioning Muslim state, and the Khazars who had once collected their tribute were a memory. East Slav tribes that had paid taxes to Itil now found themselves under Kiev's protection, or claimed to have always been free. The political map of the steppe rearranged itself without ceremony, but the Khazars themselves did not disappear, they fragmented. The first pattern was absorption into neighbouring Turkic peoples. Many Khazars were ethnically indistinguishable from the Pechenegs, the Ogurs, the Cumans who moved through the same grasslands. They spoke Turkic languages. They understood steppe warfare. When the imperial structure that gave them a distinct identity collapsed, thousands of Khazar families simply became Cuman families. Within 2 generations, their grandchildren spoke only Cuman, fought only in Cuman warbands, and remembered the Khaganate as a story old people told, if they remembered it at all. Archaeology confirms this pattern without being able to name individuals. Burial practices in the Volga-Don region show continuity of population but gradual change in material culture. The distinctive Khazar ceramic styles fade. The square Khazar fortresses stop being maintained. The Hebrew inscriptions that had once marked official documents vanish. People stayed where they were. Their identity shifted around them like the river channels. A second pattern was southward retreat into the Caucasus. The mountains that had been the empire's southern wall now became a refuge. Khazar communities withdrew into Dagestan, into Chechnya, into the high valleys where no Rus army would bother to follow. These were not the courtiers of Itil or the merchants of Sarkel. They were farmers, herders, villagers who had always lived on the empire's periphery. They kept what they could of their Jewish practice, circumcision, Sabbath observance, dietary laws, but isolation took its toll. Without rabbis, without contact with the wider Jewish world, without Hebrew books, their Judaism simplified. It became folk tradition. It became memory of memory. Some of these mountain communities persisted for centuries. Arab geographers in the 12th century still noted Jewish villages in the eastern Caucasus. The Mongol invasions of the 1220s would eventually sweep through these high valleys too, but fragments held on. Even today, in parts of Dagestan and Azerbaijan, there are families who trace their ancestry not to Jerusalem or Babylon, but to the Khazar conversion, though the evidence is oral, partial, impossible to verify. A third pattern, and the most historically charged, was westward migration. We know that Jewish Khazars moved into Crimea. The peninsula had been Khazar territory for centuries, and Jewish communities there predated the empire's collapse. When Itil fell, Crimea became an obvious refuge, close enough to reach by ship or overland, already home to Karaite and Rabbinite Jewish populations, still connected to the Black Sea trade networks the Khazars had once dominated. Byzantine sources from the late 10th century mention Jewish communities in Crimean ports who spoke Turkic languages. Khazar names appear in documents from the Genoese trading colonies that later controlled the Crimean coast. From Crimea, some moved further, into the forests of what is now Ukraine, into Poland, into Lithuania. The evidence for this migration is fragmentary but persistent. Medieval Polish chronicles mention Jewish communities in Kiev and further west who spoke Turkic dialects. Place names in eastern Poland and western Ukraine, Khazari, Khazars, Khazarain, suggest Khazar settlement or at least Khazar association. Whether these names indicate actual Khazar colonists or simply areas where Slavs remembered Khazar presence is debated, but the linguistic trace exists. The problem is that we are looking for a people who did not want to be found. After the catastrophe of 965 or 969, being visibly Khazar was dangerous. The Rus had demonstrated what happened to those who stood apart. Assimilation was not just convenient, it was survival. Jewish Khazars, who moved into existing Jewish communities in Poland or Lithuania, would have adopted local customs, local dialects, local identities. Within a few generations, the Khazar origin would have been genealogical trivia, not public identity. Then came the Mongols. In the 1220s, the armies of Genghis Khan's successors swept across the Eurasian steppe with a thoroughness that made Sviatoslav's raid look like a border skirmish. The Mongol invasions did not merely defeat states, they annihilated records. Every archive, every library, every document repository in the lands they crossed was burned. The Rus chronicles we have today survived only because copies existed in monasteries the Mongols did not reach. Khazar records, if any still existed by that point, had no such protection. This is the moment when the Khazars truly become invisible. The Mongol destruction of the 13th century is the great eraser of steppe history. Civilizations that had maintained written records for centuries, including the Khazar state with its Hebrew script documents, its diplomatic correspondence, its legal records, lost everything in a single generation of conquest. If a Khazar historian in some Volga settlement had written a history of the empire, compiling the memories of survivors and the documents that escaped the Rus sack, that history burned in 1223 or 1237 or 1240. We will never know what it contained. One last flash of recognition. In the 1240s, a generation after the initial Mongol invasion, we have a report of Jewish Khazar fighters appearing alongside Cumans against the Mongol advance. The source is fragmentary, a line in a Persian chronicle, a passing mention, but it tells us something. Some Khazars, a quarter millennium after the destruction of their empire, had kept enough of a distinct military identity that an outside observer could still name them. They were not a state. They were not even a tribe in any organized sense. They were a memory that picked up weapons. After that, silence. No Khazar book survives. No Khazar inscription on a public building. No Khazar poem, no Khazar legal code, no Khazar merchant's ledger. An entire literary civilization, and it was a literary civilization, producing documents in Hebrew script for 3 centuries, left behind not a single complete text. The language itself vanished. We know Khazar was Turkic. We have a handful of words recovered from Byzantine and Arab sources. Titles, place names, the names of Khagans. That is the entire dictionary. 3 centuries of imperial administration. 500,000 square kilometers. A city larger than any in Western Europe. A conversion that had no parallel in medieval history. And what remains could fit on a single sheet of paper. The people who had been Khazars became Ukrainians, Russians, Poles, Hungarians, Crimeans, Tatars, Turks, Azerbaijanis. They became Christians, Muslims, Jews, the Jewish line continuing most visibly but not exclusively. They married their neighbours. They forgot their grandparents' language. They stopped telling the stories that marked them as different. By 1300, a traveller passing through the Volga Delta would have seen only fishing villages and reed marshes. No one would have told him that the grass he walked on covered a metropolis. No one would have pointed to the river and said, "There, that is where the Khagan died. The empire was dead. The people had scattered into other peoples." But the forgetting that took. When Gibbon wrote his history of the Roman Empire in the 1780s, he knew about the Khazars. He gave them a line that guaranteed some form of immortality, the battle that determined whether Europe would become Islamic. And for a while that line kept them alive in educated memory. 19th century historians read Gibbon. They knew there had been a Khazar state. They knew it had been Jewish. They knew it had fought the caliphate head. Then something happened. Or rather, nothing happened. Open a standard world history textbook today. Find the chapter on medieval Europe. There will be sections on Charlemagne, on the Vikings, on the feudal system, on the Crusades. There will be maps showing the expansion of Islam across North Africa and into Spain. There will be paragraphs about Byzantium, about the Silk Road, about the rise of Russia. The Khazars will not appear, not as a footnote, not as a sentence. They are simply absent, as though the land between the Caspian and Black Seas was empty for 3 centuries, as though nobody controlled the Caucasus passes, as though the Volga trade route functioned by itself. This is not an accident of limited space. It is a structural feature of how Western history is organized. The medieval world, as taught in most educational systems, is divided into 3 spheres: Christendom, Islam, Asia. Christendom expands from the Frankish kingdoms into the Holy Roman Empire, absorbs the Vikings, launches the Crusades, develops universities and cathedrals. Islam expands from Arabia across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain, preserving classical learning, building cities like Baghdad and Cordoba that dwarf anything in Europe. Asia, a vague category that lumps together China, India, the steppe nomads, and everything else, remains peripheral, a source of invasions and trade goods but not a subject of serious study in its own right. 3 categories, 3 narrative tracks. The Khazars fit none of them. They were not Christian, so they do not belong to the story of Christendom. They were not Muslim, so they do not belong to the story of the caliphates. They were not Asian in any sense that fits the Western category. Not Chinese, not Indian, not Mongol. They were Turkic steppe people who converted to Judaism and built a trading empire. That combination, Turkic, Jewish, commercial, imperial, does not compute in the standard medieval taxonomy. It is a category error, and category errors do not get taught. The Jewishness of the Khazars created additional complications. Jewish history, as conventionally narrated, moves from the destruction of the Second Temple to the diaspora experience in Christian and Muslim lands, persecution, scholarship, survival. A sovereign Jewish kingdom that existed for 3 centuries in the medieval period disrupts that narrative. It raises questions that standard Jewish history is not structured to answer. Why did rabbinic authorities not write more about them? Why did Jewish travelers not document Khazar communities more thoroughly? The answers may be mundane: distance, the difficulty of travel, the collapse of Khazar records. But the result is that the Khazars exist in an uncomfortable gap even within Jewish historiography. So the Khazars fell between categories, and categories are how history gets preserved. Think about what survives from the medieval world. Not just physical objects, buildings, manuscripts, coins, but narrative survival. The reason Charlemagne is famous is not simply that he was powerful. It is that his Frankish successors, and the church that anointed him, and the French nation that later claimed him as a founding figure, all had reasons to keep his memory alive. Institutions preserved his story. The same is true of Saladin, of Genghis Khan, of Alfred the Great. Each of them fits into a living historical tradition that maintained their memory because that memory served a purpose. The Khazars had no such institutional afterlife. They were not claimed by any modern nation as direct ancestors, at least not successfully. They were not incorporated into any religious tradition as foundational figures. Their Judaism, which should have given them a place in Jewish historical memory, was instead a source of awkwardness, a sovereign Jewish state that did not descend from David, a conversion that raised uncomfortable questions. Their Turkic identity, which should have connected them to the great steppe empires that followed, was instead overwritten by the waves of later Turkic peoples, Cumans, Kipchaks, Tatars, who had no interest in preserving Khazar memory. The Khazars became a bridge that nobody needed to cross. Gibbon noticed them because Gibbon was writing the history of Rome's decline, and the Khazars intersected with Byzantine and Islamic history at a moment of high drama. He had a use for them. Later generations of historians writing national histories for modern European states did not. The Khazars were not part of anyone's origin story, so they faded from the standard narrative, not through active suppression. No conspiracy was required, but through the quieter mechanism of irrelevance to the stories that came after. Consider what it takes to keep a civilization's memory alive across 1,000 years. You need texts. You need institutions that copy those texts. You need people who read them, teach them, argue about them. You need a chain of transmission, scribe to scribe, teacher to student, generation to generation, that never breaks. The Khazar chain broke not once but repeatedly. The Rus sack destroyed the central archives. The Mongol invasions obliterated whatever regional records remained. The assimilation of Khazar populations into other peoples dissolved the living memory. By the time anyone thought to ask, what happened to the Khazars? There was nobody left to answer. Compare this to civilizations that did survive in memory. The Romans left stone ruins across 3 continents, a legal tradition that became the basis of European law, a language that remained the lingua franca of educated Europe for 1,000 years after the Western Empire fell. The memory of Rome was overdetermined. Too many institutions, too many texts, too many successor states, all claiming its mantle for it to be forgotten. The Khazars built in wood on a shifting delta. Their language vanished, their text burned, their successors claimed other ancestors. The result is a hole in the historical record that most people do not even know is there. You cannot miss what you were never taught existed. The absence of the Khazars from standard curricula is not experienced as a gap. It is experienced as nothing. The land between the Caspian and Black Seas in the 8th century is simply blank in the mental map most people carry. If they think of it at all, they imagine scattered nomads, empty grassland, a periphery waiting for Russia to be born. Close your eyes. Picture the world in the year 800. You can probably see Charlemagne's court at Aachen, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, Tang Dynasty China, the Mayan cities in Central America. These are the standard images, the ones that textbooks and documentaries have given you. Now try to picture Itil. Try to see the harbour crowded with ships from a dozen nations. The Jewish quarter where scribes are writing documents in Hebrew script. The Muslim quarter where merchants are counting Abbasid silver. The pagan quarter where traders from the northern forests are bartering furs. The Khagan's palace on its island in the Volga, veiled in silk, a figure of such sacred power that he almost never appeared in public. You cannot picture it clearly, neither can I. Neither can the archaeologists who have spent decades searching for its remains. That inability is not a personal failure. It is a historical one, a failure of preservation, of transmission, of categorization. The Khazars did not simply vanish, they were forgotten. And forgetting is a process with its own mechanics, its own logic, its own relentless efficiency. That process is still at work. And yet the Khazars have not stayed forgotten. Not quite, not entirely. Because in the centuries since their disappearance, something strange happened. Their bones got dug up. Not literally, the Volga Delta has given up almost nothing. But their story, the fragments that survive, turned out to be useful. And usefulness, more than truth, is what keeps a memory alive in the world of politics. Here is what the Khazar Empire has become in the 21st century. A skeleton fought over by people who need it to prove different things. Start with the most explosive claim. If Ashkenazi Jews descend not from the ancient Israelites, but from Turkic converts on the Volga, then the entire foundation of Jewish peoplehood shifts. The land of Israel becomes, in this telling, a place Ashkenazi Jews have no ancestral claim to, because their real ancestors were steppe horsemen who never saw Jerusalem. This is not a fringe argument whispered in dark corners of the internet. It has been advanced at the United Nations, in academic conferences, in newspaper columns across the Middle East. The Khazar thesis, first popularized by Arthur Koestler's 1976 book, The 13th Tribe, has become one of the standard weapons in the rhetorical arsenal of anti-Zionism. Koestler himself was a Zionist. He wrote the book to argue that if Ashkenazi Jews were not Semitic in origin, then anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews as a race, had no logical basis. He believed he was dissolving a justification for Jew hatred. Instead, he handed a powerful tool to people who wanted to undermine Jewish claims entirely. The Khazar thesis got picked up by anti-Israeli activists, by Arab nationalists, by anyone who wanted to argue that European Jews were not a people returning to their homeland, but colonists occupying someone else's. This argument has a brutal simplicity. If your ancestors were Khazars, what were you doing in the West Bank? The genetic evidence, as we have seen, does not support this claim. Mainstream studies find Ashkenazi lineages overwhelmingly Near Eastern. The Khazar contribution, if it exists at all, is marginal, but genetics is slow and complicated. Politics is fast and simple. The Khazar thesis circulates because it serves a purpose, not because the science is solid. Now turn the lens around. If anti-Zionists use the Khazars to delegitimize Jewish claims, some Jewish nationalists have their own complicated relationship with the Khazar story. A sovereign Jewish kingdom that existed for 3 centuries outside the land of Israel. That should be a point of pride, a demonstration that Jewish statehood is not a modern invention, but a recurring historical pattern. But the Khazars were converts. Their Judaism, in the eyes of some, was not authentic. They did not descend from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were outsiders who chose to become Jewish, and choice, in certain readings of Jewish identity, is less legitimate than birth. So some Jewish historians have sidelined the Khazars, not suppressed them actively. The sources are too thin for suppression to be necessary, but simply not emphasize them. The narrative of Jewish history runs from Jerusalem to Diaspora, from Second Temple to Return. The Khazars, sitting awkwardly in the medieval steppe, do not easily fit. They are a digression from the main story, a footnote, an anomaly. Identity is always selective. Every people remembers some ancestors and forgets others. The Khazars are an ancestor that different groups remember or forget for different reasons, and the choice is never neutral. Now move east. In Tatarstan, a republic within the Russian Federation on the Middle Volga, the Khazars have become something else entirely: founding fathers. Tatar nationalists, looking for a pre-Russian, pre-Mongol history that establishes their distinctiveness, have claimed Khazar heritage. The logic is geographic. The Khazars ruled the Volga. The Tatars now live along the Volga. And linguistic, a connection through the broader Turkic family. Museums in Kazan, the Tatar capital, display Khazar period artifacts. Scholarly conferences explore the Khazar roots of Tatar civilization. The claim is not universally accepted. Many historians argue the Volga Bulgars, not the Khazars, are the direct ancestors of the modern Tatars, but the claim serves a function. It gives a people, long dominated by Moscow, a glorious imperial past of their own. In Azerbaijan, a similar dynamic plays out. The Khazars controlled parts of what is now Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijani historians have claimed them as part of the national lineage. This is not merely academic nostalgia. In a region where oil wealth and geopolitical competition have raised the stakes of every historical argument, Claiming the Khazars means claiming a legacy of power, sophistication, and independence that predates Persian, Russian, and Soviet domination. It means saying, we were here before the empires that tried to erase us. The Khazar Empire in this telling was an early Azerbaijani state. The Khagan was a Turkic ruler whose descendants, culturally if not biologically, are the people of modern Baku. The evidence for direct continuity is thin, but identity politics does not run on evidence, it runs on need. And then there is Russia. The Russian relationship with the Khazar legacy is the most complicated of all, because it changes depending on who is speaking and what they want to prove. One Russian narrative casts the Khazars as a proto-Russian state. The argument goes like this. The Khazars ruled over East Slavic tribes, collected tribute from them, incorporated them into a larger imperial system. When the Kievan Ruses rose and destroyed the Khazars, they inherited not Khazar territory but Khazar state structures. The habit of rule, the mechanisms of taxation, the concept of a multi-ethnic empire held together by a central authority. In this reading, the Khazars are not foreign occupiers but a preparatory stage in Russian state formation. The Ruses learned how to be an empire from the Khazars, and modern Russia is the distant heir of that learning. But there is another Russian narrative, and it says the opposite. In this version, the Khazars were a foreign, non-Slavic Jewish power that exploited the innocent East Slavs for centuries until the heroic Sviatoslav liberated them. The Khazars are the enemy, the oppressor, the dark force that the Ruses had to destroy so that Russian civilization could be born. This narrative does not want to claim the Khazars. It wants to celebrate their destruction. Which version you hear depends on what Russia needs at that moment. When Russian nationalism emphasizes continuity and imperial greatness, the Khazars can be precursors. When Russian nationalism emphasizes Slavic purity and resistance to outsiders, the Khazars are parasites. The same historical facts. Khazar tribute over Slavs, Russia's destruction of the Khazar state, can be told either way. The facts do not change, the meaning does. This is not unique to Russia. Every modern nation that cares about the Khazars finds in them what it needs. The Khazar skeleton has no voice of its own, no living descendants to say, no, that is not who we were. So it gets dressed in whatever clothes the present moment requires. Think about what this means for the Khazars themselves. An empire that spent 3 centuries carefully positioning itself between worlds, neither Christian nor Muslim, neither European nor Asian, a Jewish state in a steppe of pagans and monotheists, has become, in its afterlife, a blank screen onto which modern political movements project their own anxieties and ambitions. The Khazars chose their identity with precision. They refused to be absorbed into Byzantium or the Caliphate. They insisted on being something separate. And now, 12 centuries later, they are whatever anyone needs them to be. The mystery refuses to go quiet. The genetic controversy, the archaeological absence, the political appropriations, all of it keeps the Khazar name alive in ways that a simple, settled historical memory never would. If the Khazars had left stone ruins and clear descendants, they might be another forgotten medieval kingdom, catalogued and filed away in academic journals. Instead, they are a live wire, sparking in every hand that touches them. The past does not stay in the past. It gets picked up, reshaped, weaponized. The Khazars' empire is one of the clearest demonstrations of this principle in all of medieval history. A Turkic people who became a Jewish state and then vanished. How could that not become a battleground? And now we sit with the full weight of what that means. An empire of 500,000 square kilometers. A capital larger than Paris, London or Rome at the time. A literate ruling class using Hebrew script. A legal system with 7 judges who adjudicated 4 different religious laws under one state. 3 centuries of diplomatic relationships with Byzantium, the Caliphate, and the emerging powers of the north. Military victories that, in the assessment of one of the great historians of the Enlightenment, may have determined the religious shape of an entire continent, and almost nobody knows their name. This is not a lament. Lamenting is easy. Lamenting lets you feel sad and then move on without asking the harder question. The harder question is, how does this happen? How does a civilization that was visible to literally every major power of its era become a blank space in the historical consciousness of the world that came after? The Khazar case is not unique in the abstract. Other empires have fallen and been forgotten, but those empires tend to be distant, lost in the deep past where the darkness is expected. The Indus Valley civilization vanished and left a script we still cannot read. The Minoans became myth. But those are Bronze Age peoples, separated from us by 3,000 or 4,000 years. The Khazars were medieval. They existed alongside civilizations whose records we still have, whose names schoolchildren still learn. Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD. At that exact moment, the Khazar Khagan was ruling a Jewish state on the Volga, receiving embassies from Byzantium, adjudicating disputes between Muslims and Christians and pagans in a purpose-built capital. Charlemagne is a founding figure of European identity. The Khagan is a question mark. The difference is not in their importance to contemporaries. The difference is in what happened after. After Charlemagne's empire fragmented, his successors built monasteries and commissioned chronicles that preserved his memory. Stone cathedrals rose over his tomb. His legend grew. The Khazars built in wood. The Volga Delta shifted and buried their capital under silt. The Rus burned what remained. The Mongols finished the job. No Khazar monastery copied Khazar texts. No Khazar dynasty survived to commission Khazar chronicles. The chain of transmission broke not once but repeatedly until there was nothing left to transmit. The result is not just the loss of a civilization. It is the loss of the awareness that anything was lost. People walk through the world assuming that what is important gets remembered, that the historical record, however incomplete, captures the broad outlines of what mattered. The Khazar Empire is the counterexample that shatters that assumption. It mattered profoundly. It shaped borders and religions and populations, and it was forgotten so completely that its very existence sounds to a modern ear like a conspiracy theory or a myth. You tell someone there was a Jewish empire on the steppe for 300 years, and their first instinct is disbelief. That cannot be right. I would have heard of that. I took world history. I know the Middle Ages, and yet, that disbelief is the point. That disbelief is the hole in our historical knowledge that the Khazars reveal. If Itil, a city of markets and harbours and separate religious quarters, a city that Arab geographers described in detail, a city that handled silver dirhams from Samarkand and furs from the Arctic and silk from Constantinople, if that city can be swallowed by geology and politics and time so completely that we cannot even find it with ground-penetrating radar in 2024, then what else is missing? Not what else is missing from the ancient world. The deep past is a darkness we already know. What else is missing from the medieval world? From the world of written records and stone buildings and named kings? What other civilizations sat at the crossroads of major powers, shaped events we think we understand, and then slipped through the categories we use to organize history? The Khazars slipped because they fit nowhere. Christendom, Islam, Asia, the tripartite division of medieval history that structures most textbooks, has no slot for a Turkic Jewish trading empire. They were not European, so European historians did not claim them. They were not Islamic, so Islamic historians treated them as a curiosity. They were not Asian, in the sense that Western history means when it says Asia. They were not Chinese, not Indian, not part of the great Eastern civilizations that get their own chapters. They were a steppe people, and steppe peoples in Western historiography are usually the enemy. The Huns, the Mongols, the barbarians at the gate. But the Khazars were not barbarians. They were sophisticated state builders who ran a multi-faith legal system that contemporary European kingdoms could not have imagined. Try to picture the court of Charlemagne appointing separate judges for Jews, Muslims, Christians, and pagans, so that each community could live under its own law. The idea would have been incomprehensible. The Khazars did it as a matter of routine administration. This is not romanticizing them. The Khazar state extracted tribute from subject peoples. It fought wars. It had an elite that converted while commoners kept their old gods. It was a medieval empire, with all the hierarchy and violence that implies. But it was also an empire that solved a problem: how to govern a multi-religious commercial crossroads, in a way that looks, from a distance, strikingly modern. And then the solution vanished, and the problem got solved differently by other powers, and nobody remembered that the Khazars had shown another way. The fragility is not just in the physical record, it is in the narrative record. History is not what happened, history is what gets told. And what gets told depends on who survives to do the telling, who has institutions to preserve the telling, and who has descendants who care about the telling. The Khazars had none of these. No modern nation exists that calls itself Khazar. No government funds Khazar archaeological digs as a matter of national pride. No school system teaches Khazar history as the first chapter of the national story. The Khazars have no lobby, and without a lobby the past goes quiet. This is not a conspiracy. No committee decided to erase the Khazars. No secret archive holds the suppressed truth. The erasure was structural, passive, cumulative. 1,000 small failures of preservation and transmission, each one unremarkable on its own, combined to produce a total result that is staggering. The most important medieval empire you have never heard of is not a marketing line. It is a statement of fact that should, if you sit with it long enough, make you deeply uncomfortable. Because if the Khazars can be forgotten, then the historical record is not a solid foundation beneath our feet. It is a raft of surviving evidence floating on an ocean of lost information. We do not know how much is gone. We cannot know. The silence where a civilization should be does not announce itself. It just sits there, unnoticed, until someone trips over it. You are listening to this now. You know the name Khazar. That puts you in a small minority of living humans. Most people will go their whole lives without encountering this story. Their sense of medieval history will be complete without it. Charlemagne, the Caliphate, the Vikings, the Crusades, all real, all important, all remembered. And the Jewish Empire on the steppe that held the Caucasus passes for 300 years. That never happened. Not because it did not happen, but because it did not survive the transmission. The Khazar Empire is a mirror held up to our own confidence in the completeness of the historical record. The reflection is not flattering. The wind still moves through the grass where Itil stood. The Volga still shifts its channels through the delta. The fishermen in the villages there do not know the name of the city beneath the silt. The world has moved on. It always does. But somewhere in the darkness of the archive, in a Cairo storeroom or a Cordoba library or a Russian chronicle, a few fragments survived. Enough to know that something vast is missing. Enough to ask the question that the Khazars leave behind them, the question that no amount of scholarship can fully answer. What else has been forgotten?